Hello all, can you see me? Please say hi in the chat, please. Hi Erica, thank you for letting me know. It's a little bit silent over here, so I'm glad to hear from you guys. So today we're going to talk about a very interesting topic and a very complex and comprehensive topic, and that's brain-based coaching. Now that's a new, not really an approach, but a relatively new framework. And as you'll see, it's based on advances in neuroscience. So what it does is all the usual coaching practices that you guys are used to. You'll see that neuroscience is actually giving evidence why and how those work in practice. So let's start. And if you don't understand or follow everything immediately, just follow me and the PDF slides will be available afterwards. We've got quite a bit to go through, so let's get started. So first of all, I'm going to look at what is brain-based coaching. We're going to have a quick look at the insights and some of the benefits of it as well. Then we're going to look very briefly, as you can imagine, on certain brain areas and how that fit into coaching practices and coaching methods. We're going to look at some of the brain chemicals, the natural brain chemicals and hormones, and how you can actually utilize that in your coaching. Some of the brain concepts that you'll find very interesting. Then I'm going to take you quickly through a neurological stimulus effect cycle. So it'll explain how the whole process actually fits together. And we'll end off looking at how we can have power over our brain and help our clients do the same, and then apply some of these brain-based principles to different aspects of the coaching relationship and process. So you guys are welcome to ask questions in the chat throughout. I'll have a quick look now and then and answer as I go along. So what is brain-based coaching? As I said, it's a coaching approach, or more of a framework that is rooted in modern neuroscience. So as you can imagine, neuroscience has really advanced in the last 10 years or so with imaging, brain imaging, imaging while you're actually active, so live imaging as well. It can tell us a lot if you're busy with a specific task or a specific focus. It actually tracks which areas of the brain are active at that point and how it changes over time. So it cultivates the neuroscience of the growth mindset. So it shows you how the brain works and how it should work and how you can develop it to build a growth mindset. It harnesses brain-based conversation skills to generate insights and build connections. So it helps you to activate certain areas in your brain that can help with these insights and new ideas and creative ideas as well. So in essence, it combines the art and science of coaching. It utilizes a specific structure to impact the brain. So you'll do certain exercises with the client and have certain approaches and certain methods with a certain goal to impact the brain and mind. And we'll get in more detail later on. And it shows how you can embed new learning and behavior by rewiring the brain. Now, maybe you didn't think that was possible, but we'll go through that in a little bit as well. So just first of all, 6 insights that brain-based coaching is based on. First of all, the brain is a connection machine. It's got like 100 trillion connections that fires and work together the whole time. Absolutely the whole time. No two brains are wired the same, so we can't even talk about a normal brain. No two brains are the same. If you take a brain scan, there will not be a normal brain and an abnormal brain, just differing in functionality and in structure. So the third insight is that the brain sees the world according to its own wiring. Now that's very important because each of us have different filters, and we get a lot of stimuli from the outside, which we interpret differently, and we'll have a look at that later on as well. The fourth one is quite important and interesting. The brain hardwires everything it can. And there's a very good reason for that. By hardwiring something, you're able to bypass the conscious mind. So the conscious mind is what sits on top, and then you've got the subconscious mind between the conscious and the unconscious mind. And everything that goes through the conscious mind is slower because it involves decision making, it involves thoughts, it involves you being uncertain of certain things, needing to learn certain things first to gain knowledge. So if you can activate the subconscious or even unconscious mind, the body reacts a lot quicker. And a good example of this is the stress reaction, the flight or fight reaction. So the brain receives stimuli that it considers threatening, and maybe you're not even aware of it, but it immediately reacts and involves the whole body to get you ready to do a certain action. Number 5, it's practically impossible to deconstruct the hardwiring. Now, the hardwiring is not all that there is. And as number 6 say, it's easy to create new wiring. So the new wiring can actually bypass the old hardwiring in a sense. So if the hardwiring is not useful to you or it's not helpful, then, and that's what we do in coaching in part as well, is we help clients to create a new wiring so that they can bypass their own, for instance, limiting beliefs. That can be a hard wiring as well. Now, the benefits of brain-based coaching. It gives a greater clarity for an improved sense of direction and focus. So it helps reduce stress, and it helps clear your mind so that you can have clarity and do more things in your conscious mind than automatically on autopilot in your subconscious mind. There is an increased self-awareness and a responsibility or accountability for the actions that you have control over and the consequences of those actions. It causes an improved ability to relate to and influence others. So it will definitely have an influence over your relationship and how you are able to interact with others, your relationships, your bonding with people, how you communicate with them as well. And usually it increases things like trust and empathy. Now, it also impacts on confidence, motivation, and conviction. So commitment to do something that will help you achieve goals. Now, how this will all work, we'll get to throughout the presentation. And as a result of all of this, you'll have improved personal productivity and effectiveness. And you'll be able to have better resources and resilience available to you when you face challenges and when you need some support. just trying to go back a slide. And now I'm just going forward. Let me get out of this quickly. All right, so this is a very busy slide, and I'm not expecting you to be able to read, follow, remember, understand everything in here. Neither do I. It's there for your own reference. So if you have the PDF slides later on, you can refer back. Some of the slides following this one will actually refer to some of those areas in general. So then you can at least have a good look and keep it for your reference as well. This is actually the best image of the brain from different angles that I could find. So it shows it from the lateral view, from the top view, from the center view. So if you were able to separate the two lobes or hemispheres, look at it from the inside, and then from the bottom, from the interior view. So this is basically, we're going to talk a little bit about the prefrontal cortex, for instance. That's where the frontal lobe number 13 is. And then we're going to talk about some of the sensory areas, numbers 9 and 10. And as you can see already here, the prefrontal cortex number 13 is a very important area of your brain, as it is involved in concentration, planning, judgment, emotional expression, creativity, and inhibition. And for instance, the functionality of this area will be quite limited in a person with, for instance, antisocial tendencies, which means that they've got problems planning, they've got problems having goal-directed actions, and things like empathy as well, and judgment. And they have usually very blunted emotions. So as you can see, these are very important, and it determines how the structure and activity and connectivity between all these areas are. Right, so now we get to some of the brain areas and how it relates to coaching. I've only chosen 5 areas. As you can imagine, one can look at the entire brain, and there are many, many areas, 23 or something as listed in the previous slide. So we're just going to look at 5 of those. Now, first of all, as I said, the prefrontal cortex, and that's the one sitting right at the front of your brain. And it's involved in planning, decision-making, the expression of your personality, how you align your thoughts and your actions with the goals that you have. So the better developed your prefrontal cortex is, the more you'll be able to have goal-directed behavior and thinking, and how you are able to moderate social behavior. So in this area, we can help our clients manage their energy levels, lower stress, because if you lower stress, it will help this area to function better as well, and breaking down goals and planning so that it's not so overwhelming. So that's where you take a big goal and you break it down into the smaller goals and smallest action steps. Mindfulness, single tasking, how you prioritize, all help here as well to have the prefrontal cortex function better. And it's a great idea when you start off with a client to look for low-hanging fruit. Those are easy actions that they can take to already show them that they can make progress, and that will increase their confidence, it will lower their stress, it will increase their motivation, their energy levels, And you see where I go with this. They will just be able to then go further and work on more important and bigger goals. And then daily routines here are very important as well. The basal ganglia, it's the key to storing routines, and it's also where the function of repetitive behaviors and thoughts find its home. So that's why I put in brackets, it's the home of habits, basically. So here you want to create accountability, give the client some reminders or have them set their own reminders. If then plan, so if they do this, then they can expect that, is a very good idea because it gives them a reason and a commitment to do the action that they need to, the if, to get to the then, which is the outcome. And we'll have a look at the chemicals later on, but all of this triggers dopamine as well, which we'll see is a very, very important chemical, brain chemical or hormone related to motivation and reward. The amygdala, it regulates our emotional life that drives a lot of behavior. Now, as you know, emotions and thoughts are actually only there to compel you to act, to compel you to do something. So you have a thought and you have an emotion, and the emotion, whether it's joy or something negative, it actually drives you to do something. And that's the basic reason we have emotions. An evolutionary reason, I must add. So it identifies fears that are holding your client back. And you can experiment with the client to identify, first of all, the inputs to these fears and the triggers, and what they can do in terms of healthier ways to either avoid or change the inputs or triggers, or just do something else. Another option is to have a client, to work with a client to develop a low fear inner dialogue, find solutions, help him or her find solutions to their challenges through, as you all probably know by now, is done by questioning in the coaching process. I'm just looking at a question asked by Andrea. Yes and no. It depends on what the level of the antisocial behavior is. If you're a psychopath, and there are certain types of psychopaths, I must add. So the one is more hardwired, it's more genetic. The other one is more environmental. So your background played a larger role in you being antisocial or psychopathic. And if it's mostly environmental, then you can change it a little bit easier. It takes a long time. If it's hardwired, genetic, it's often very difficult. And the biggest challenge to work with people who are antisocial is that they often do not have insight that they are. They don't see it as their problem, and they tend to blame other things and other people for issues that they have. But you can teach and improve your frontal lobe. But the most important thing I would say is that you need to create awareness and insight with your client in order for him, you know that that is the basis of all change. So you need to create that in order for him to have the motivation and the accountability to work on the change that they require. I hope I've answered your question, Andrea. So back to the amygdala. So you can develop a low fear inner dialogue. You can help your client to speak more kindly to themselves. We all have an inner dialogue. Thanks, it's a pleasure, Andrea. To have a kind and accepting inner dialogue, and not be overly critical the whole time with ourselves and expect perfectionism. Jenny, the question was, can you teach and improve your frontal lobe if you are one of those antisocial people? And it's actually, if you look at the question and answer section, you'll find it there. So you help a client find solutions to challenges through open-ended questioning. And you'll see throughout as well that to lower anxiety before making decisions and to lower anxiety and stress levels in general is very, very important in most of these areas. Right, so we're going to look at brain chemicals and coaching next, and this is actually very important. So I'll explain in the cycle later on. But when you've got a stimuli coming from the outside, you've experienced something, it's a sense that you have a touch, a visual image, whatever the case may be, you get a stimulus from the outside, and it goes into the structure of your brain, into the receptors, and those react, and it releases certain brain chemicals as a result. So the first one I want to talk about is cortisol, the stress hormone. So this is one of the two that readies your body for fight or flight. And prolonged levels are linked to distress, which is not the good form of stress. You get eustress as well, which is actually a stress that is healthy and a stress that is helpful to get you to act in the right way. This stress is overwhelming, it's too much, and you are often forced to cope in unhealthy ways. As a result of higher cortisol levels, you run a risk of having a lower quality of life. So medical issues like obesity, for instance, high blood pressure, these can all be results of prolonged high cortisol levels. And in this sense, you can help identify and eliminate stress triggers that your client often experiences. And they can have a look at then meditation, exercise, sleep, nutrition, having a little bit of humor in their life, art, utilizing art as a way to reduce the cortisol levels or cortisol secretion, and then hobbies as well. And you would have things like social interaction here too. The next one that I want to quickly mention is dopamine. So this is also an important chemical that is involved in our motivation and reaction to reward and punishment. And I think we'll talk a little bit later on about this in more detail, but it's actually when you already anticipate a reward or a punishment, but especially a reward, that dopamine is released in your brain, and it's got a very pleasant reaction or feeling, and so you are motivated to do that action to get that reward. And that's why I say in this regard, you can have your clients associate rewards with action. Now, the most important thing to realize about these things, both the brain functioning, the brain areas, the activity of the brain areas, and the release of brain chemicals, as the more it happens, the more it's likely to happen in the future. So it strengthens the habit, it strengthens the pathways, and this is why one should have all of these things that you do to increase or decrease some of these. You should form it into habits for your clients so that they can strengthen the release of dopamine, for instance, more often, or reduce the release of cortisol more often. And the next time it happens, it will happen just so much more easier. Oxytocin is the so-called love chemical, which is involved in building trust and social bonding. Yes, it does. It does. And I'll get to, in a couple of slides, I'll get to a diagram that will show how it actually does that in a whole cycle. So it moves all the way from a trigger event through to how the brain reacts, how it releases these things, how you then react in terms of thoughts and feelings and actions, what you do then, the feedback that you receive, the consequences, and how that whole cycle continues again. So if it's a pleasant cycle, it will repeat and it will go through the structural part of the brain or the wiring of the brain again and strengthen that wiring. And if it's not a pleasant experience, hopefully it won't happen again. You'll find some other alternative that is healthier. And because it doesn't happen again, it will actually weaken that whole cycle and that specific structural area where that happens. As far as I know, this is very quickly. So cortisol, if we talk about prolonged levels, it's a constant release. If it's a quick release like adrenaline, for instance, we'll talk about that as well. It's a very quick spike and back down, almost like when you consume sugar. So it doesn't, the half-life of these hormones are not long at all. So back to oxytocin, which is involved in building trust and social bonding. So that's when, for instance, you hold a baby or you touch somebody or you pet your dog, you'll immediately get an overwhelming release of this chemical in your brain, and it feels good. So you tend to become protective, you trust the other person, you've got empathy for them, and you build a stronger bond because of that. And that's one of the reasons basically why something like a baby is so good at having oxytocin released in their mother's brain, so that their protective nature is increased. Right, so it's also involved in showing empathy and holding a safe space if you're a coach, and that will release some of those chemicals in your client and in yourself as well. So that will increase the trust and rapport between you two. So you can also encourage your client to be engaged in more social activities and, for instance, balance their social media use, so they get more value out of a positive aspect out of that, and not the negative and the distrust and all the negative things that they may read on their conspiracies and false news and all of that. Right. Adrenaline, we've talked a little bit about that already. It's also involved in the flight or fight response, it should have said. And it acts on nearly every tissue in the body. And as I've said, this is the release of this is subconscious or unconscious and instantaneous. And it doesn't last very long as well. So it's like a way to kickstart your body into action. So it's when you see a lion, you don't even think about it. You decide whether your unconscious mind decide whether it's best to flee or to fight. So it's part of an emotional response to what we see unconsciously or automatically, usually as threatening. And it also enhances, and this can be a problem, so it enhances memories of stressful events. So you tend to get an imbalance between instances where you had adrenaline, which is normally not a very good experience, unless you're into extreme sports or something like that, which is one of the reasons for the appeal of extreme sports, by the way. And you tend to remember those events more clearly. As such, it's very much linked to chronic stress and PTSD too. So what you can do in this regard, if a client has got a problem with adrenaline, with stress that they can't control, for instance, or stress at inappropriate times, you can do what I've called an adrenaline audit with your client. So you have a look at the past week, see where they had instances where they thought this may have kicked in. You have a look at what they thought, felt, and did at that time, whether it was helpful or positive, and what preceded and triggered these events, and how it can be changed or avoided. So this can be part of their daily journal, their daily thought journal as well. So if they've got this type of a problem, that they've got stress that they cannot control, like a startle response that they cannot control, for instance, they can write down in their journal when it happened, what preceded it, what do they think caused it, who was present, what were the circumstances, what did they feel, what did they do, and then they can have a look at those triggers, for instance, and the events that it took place in, and how they can change either the events or their perception of it, or avoid the circumstances altogether. That's a good question, Tyler. I don't think it will lead to PTSD. It may lead to not so much chronic stress, I would say, but you can get addicted to it. So you'll probably do more and more extreme sports, take more and more risks. And if you have a look at people that do extreme sports, you'll often find those patterns as well. So they become addicted to it, and as any other addictive substance, like drugs or alcohol, you become used to it, and you need more and more to have the same effect. So I think that's more of the bigger problem in that regard, is that you build a resistance to it, and you need more, and therefore you take more risks, which obviously have a bigger probability of harm to you. Serotonin is the next one. So this chemical is important for mood regulation, appetite, and sleep. And I know you can take additives, serotonin additives, which is helpful, for instance, to regulate your sleep. So low levels of this can be linked to feeling low or anxious. So you feel overtired, you worry a lot, you feel burnt out. And in this regard, some of the things you can do is to eat things like bananas, seeds, dates, even chocolate, because it has a substance called tryptophan, which is rich in serotonin. And then another thing you can do is to limit alcohol consumption as well. So as I said, serotonin is useful to regulate your sleep cycle. and your daily rhythms of sleep and being awake and energy, you should try and help your client avoid worrying, constant worrying or rumination, because that decreases these levels. They can do that as well through visualizing a happy place. Now, pretty soon in the next day or two, I'll add to the coaching library a guided meditation on visualizing your happy place. So that will be there as well. And then having an attitude or cultivating an attitude of gratitude can also help to increase your serotonin levels. Endorphins, they are the last brain chemical I would like to talk about, and that's usually the one that you associate with doing strenuous exercise like long distance running, because it then secretes these chemicals. And as I said here, it's released during stress and in response to pain to help dull the unpleasant effects that you are feeling. So anything from exercise, music, chocolate as well. So it seems that's actually very good. Play, meditation, and the so-called 5-5 breathing, 5 counts in and 5 counts out, can stimulate endorphin release. I'm sure it can, Andrea. The problem is that it's so short-lived. So unless it's something, I'm not too sure how it works. I'm sure that they can measure it. I know, for instance, serotonin you can. So it's probably a little bit longer in half-life. But endorphins, adrenaline, and that's very instantaneous. So it happens in the moment and it works out pretty quickly. I'll try and look that up after I'm done and put it then in the on the growth space on the portal. I've chosen some foundational brain concepts as well because it's really important. And the first one is neuroplasticity. And some of you have probably heard of this already. We all tend to think, and it's a myth, that we're born with the brains that we have and it cannot change. And that's not the case at all. So neuroplasticity is the ability of the brain to change. So these include the strength of connections between different areas and how they communicate, the activity of receptors, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on in another slide. New neurons that are created, the density of white and gray matter, and this in studies of meditation, it's showed that you can actually change the density of white and gray matter, which will influence your stress levels and the clarity of your mind. And then how your brain compensates for injury. There are so many studies that show that injury to certain areas of your brain, actually your brain rewires itself so that other areas can then partially or fully do those functions instead. So I've made a statement here: the brain can physically change through self-directed neuroplasticity. And this term comes from a book that I've referenced at the end, that many of these concepts actually came from and are explained in a little bit more detail for whoever of you are interested to read more about it. So you can have your client do brain exercises, do memory practices, building habits, help with neuroplasticity, because the more you do something, as I've said before, the more it helps your brain to rewire in a different way. meditation, learning, visualization, these all help to rewire your brain or to change your brain in a sense that it can do something differently. Now, we've talked about the threat response as well when we talked about adrenaline and cortisol, and it determines much of a client's actions, especially their instinctive or subconscious actions. For instance, if they go to great lengths to avoid something, it's often due to a threat response. So you can help them identify triggers and formulate healthier responses to whatever they feel threatened or feared about. Build empathy and acceptance within the client, so self being kind to themselves, and then internalize their locus of control so that they feel there are certain things that they can control and that they actually focus on the things that they can control and not blame outside things and think that they can't change anything themselves. So the so-called Hpa Axis is important because it regulates digestion, immune system, mood, and emotions, and energy storage. And these, especially energy, mood, and emotions, they are also very important in how a person acts and behaves. And it's very much involved in burnout, anxiety, and addictions. And you can help a client to suppress cortisol and elevate their serotonin and oxytocin, and that will help the HPA axis to function a lot better. You guys are very quiet today, actually. Right. So this is what this is what I've talked about before. The neurological stimulus effect process. So I had a great deal of fun to try and put this together from how I see the whole thing put together. So we starting with the stimulus right at the top with the red arrow. So the stimulus is where you get something happens to you, you see or sense or experience an outside event, and you take it all in, and we take in hundreds of thousands of stimuli each day. And of course, our brain is not capable to receive and to process all of those. So it's got receptors, and it only takes in some of those and it interprets it using memory recall as well to further reduce the need for to analyze everything of those. So it sort of filters it, interprets, it uses your memory of previous experiences to see what you see in terms of what you expect to see. And that's why people often see that we say that we see things that we expect to see. Our brains are just, they just work that way because we can't take everything in. And a good example of this is tunnel vision as well. So you're just seeing a part of what is out there, and you're interpreting it the way your own brain is actually wired. And then depending on that interpretation, the nervous system responds. So it releases the necessary chemicals that it thinks will be helpful, depending on that interpretation of that stimulus that you received. And now with these chemicals, you have a certain experience in terms of physical sensations and in terms of thoughts and feelings that start to arise. Now, only at this point will you hopefully, not always, but hopefully become aware of your experience. So all of that has happened already and you weren't even aware of it. So now you can become aware of thoughts and feelings. maybe and hopefully. And then you're compelled to take a certain action. So you do a certain thing, you engage in a certain behavior, and there's a consequence to all behavior. And whatever the consequence is, you have a new experience, and that creates a memory that you store for later use. So that memory that you store, if you go around the circle again with a similar stimulus, that memory that you stored will be used to interpret the new event. So the brain always tries to make sense of what's happening to you by what has happened to you before, which is very interesting. And every time the cycle repeats, your receptors, your nervous system responds, and your whole experience in terms of thoughts and feelings and behavior will just be reinforced and become stronger. And that's how the wiring actually works. And if you manage to think that, let's say you disrupt the process at the experience phase, and you say, despite the fact that you're thinking and feeling this, you're going to actually reappraise and think and feel something differently and act in a better way, not have the same negative consequence, have a better memory. So next time the stimulus happens, it will be different. Interpret it differently. Your nervous system will probably react differently, and you'll have different thoughts and feelings. Now, this, of course, have to be repeated many, many times before it becomes rewired like that. But that's the basic process, how it works. I've got the same problem. All right, so you can have a look at this afterward in your own time. As I say, I will upload the PDF of the slides as well, together with the recording. So this is an example, just a practical example in terms of stress. So you've got a perceived stimulus. Your mind perceives a threat that you may be not even aware of. And now you've got a previous coping pattern, and that's the previous cycle that you've gone through, and you've thought it helped or it didn't help. But let's say you thought, it helped a little bit. So you're going to just follow that. Your mind is unconsciously going to follow the same coping pattern because it's so reinforced already. It's based on your early experience as well. So your whole belief system and genetics play a role as well. So in this example, you've got two options. You see that you think that you can fight or flee, and that will be viable options for you, or that you feel defeated. And as you can see, if your mind, your unconscious or subconscious mind actually goes for fight or flight, and this will happen instantaneous and instinctive in many cases, unless you've built the mindfulness to actually give thought, to disrupt that process and give thought behind it. Then there's certain things like adrenaline and noradrenaline that will be ignited or activated. And in the case where you defeat it, it will be ACTH. And I've given a short explanation there that I'm sure I will not be able to pronounce even, so I'll stick to ACTH. And cortisol is released. And in this case, the cortisol, we talk about half-life and how long it stays in the system. Cortisol stays a little bit longer in the system than adrenaline, for instance, because adrenaline is purely there to have you react at that instant. But this is just an example of how a perceived stimulus work and how subconsciously your body decide what to do and which chemicals to release to make you able to do that specific action or to get you ready to do that specific action. So adrenaline basically, for instance, gets you ready to fight or to flee. It gets you, it shuts down certain energy systems, releases energy systems to your muscles, for instance. It takes it away from your digestive system, gives it to your muscles, and so that you can do the right thing. Yeah, freeze will be in the defeat reaction. It's more of a do nothing, just give up, go away sort of reaction. And you're right that it's often also called fight, flight, and freeze. So, just a little bit of an acronym. DOSE is the happiness hormones. So these are the hormones that you would like for yourself and your client to be released more of: dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, and endorphin. And I've just put a reminder here to actively implement activities to increase your client's dose. No, it doesn't store. It doesn't store any of these. It has to release it when it needs them. So it's like, I don't know if I've got any people doing exercise here, for instance, strength exercise. It's like creatine as well. Your body, when it needs it, it will actually use it up within like 3 seconds. And you've got to, if you supplement with creatine, for instance, you've got to take it daily. And I think serotonin is the same thing. You've got to take it regularly and keep it at a certain level in your body for it to be available. Otherwise, it will be depleted very quickly. So, our brain dictates how we see the world. So, as I've intimated before, the world constantly floods your senses with hundreds of thousands of stimuli, so more detail than we can process. And your brain sifts and sorts between these to make sense of it, because our brain is actually wired to, its main purpose is to make sense of things so that it can decide what to do in order to help you survive. And that's also an evolutionary aspect of the brain. And when you look at it like that, it almost seems like it hasn't evolved all that much over many, many, many years. So as an example, you've got 10 times more neurons going to your eyes than from your eyes. So there's a lot more information coming in and we can't process it all. So it filters it based on certain filters like beliefs and your previous experiences, and how your brain is wired based on these beliefs and previous experiences. So your brain actually tells your eyes what to look for instead of just receiving everything. And it says here that happy chemicals help you do that by activating templates of past rewards. So if you've got more of these happy chemicals inside your brain, or you're able to release more of those, it will actually help you to focus more on good times, past successes, than on negative times and challenges. And then, as I've said before, your brain chemicals are managed by the structures of the brains that we have in common with mammals as well. And a very important thing to remember is that we have power over our brains. We all have pathways that lead where we don't want to go anymore, but remember that we can rewire our brains. by just looking at every stage in that cycle and making sure that we divert it to the more positive chemicals, more positive thoughts and feelings, and positive behavior, and it will then rewire the brain to make that an habit when it repeats. And it also reminds us that it will feel unsafe and uncomfortable at first because your brain is used to the old ways of doing things instinctively. And if you persist, then it will actually it's able to create a new pathway that will in time become subconscious as well. So I'm going to quickly go through, we don't have a lot of time at all left, but it's quite self-explanatory, so you guys can have a read through the slides here after. It quickly explains each of these 6 things, which are very important in achieving goals and important, of course, in the coaching process. So oh my goodness, no, I haven't come across magnetism at all in the topic of brain-based coaching. So if you want to, I can have a look at that for you as well. Right, let's quickly look at habits, which are regular tendencies or practices, often automatic and unconscious. Now, of course, it can help make us more efficient and productive and improve our coping mechanisms. A scientist called Hebb said that neurons that fire together wire together. So all that this means is, I'll have a look at that book, Monique. Thank you. All that this means is that when you use a certain pathway, those neurons will fire together and they will create a new wiring eventually. So that's why I'm saying repetitive thoughts and actions form and reinforce a neural network. And to do this with a client, just make sure that their stress levels are managed first, and then you can explore with them as you probably know one or more habits that are holding them back, help them understand the triggers and negative effects, clarify the benefits of changing a habit for the client, because that will increase their motivation and their accountability, and then identify small parts and action steps. And this is where some parts of the ABC framework come in as well. The ADE method, many of you would already know this from the coursework: add, delete, and edit habits, and then you implement and master it all one step at a time. Optimism means to have a positive attitude about the future, either blind optimism, which is not so good, or realistic optimism, which is actually what you seek in a client. So it means having a belief that the person has the control to make changes, although it may be difficult, but it will be worth it. And that you need to make sure with the client that they understand that they have control first of all. It may be difficult, but they have to see the benefits of making those changes, making those often difficult changes. So a client that is optimistic is mentally robust, creative, and resilient. I've talked a little bit more about the different levels of activity in the left and right brain. And we are helped to imagine positive future events by assessing emotions from past events. So you can either think of positive events in the past, or you can reappraise negative events from the past to help you see opportunities and the positive aspects of those events as well. So you can help your client connect to the pleasure of anticipation by asking them to make a list of things they're looking forward to and to choose one of them to visualize each evening. And this will help them release dopamine in their brains as well, that anticipation of something pleasant. I've got no idea, Lucy, actually how intuition would actually fit into all of this. I'll have to give it some thought in that cycle. It's probably based on how you interpret certain events and how they then follow into thoughts and feelings, if I've got to say. So it's intuition is another way of analyzing what has happened and what you think will happen next. Mindfulness. So as you know, that's intentionally focusing on the present moment with curiosity, acceptance, and openness. And it's focusing on physical sensations, for instance, breathing or your senses, or observing thoughts and feelings as they rise up and pass away. So when you're mindful, you won't not have any thoughts. They will still continue to come in, but you shouldn't try and control or hold on to or identify with them. Just let them come and let them go naturally. We've got hundreds of thousands, literally, thoughts per day. So you can imagine trying to meditate without thoughts for a minute only, how long that will take to practice and to get that right. So initially you'll have many thoughts in between, I promise you, but don't worry about it, just let them pass through. So mindfulness elevates positive emotions, reduces stress, manages pain, regulates attention and emotions, creates body awareness, and changes self-perspective. These are all the benefits that you can have from increasing your mindful attitude. And I've listed some neurological changes that you can expect when you practice mindfulness and or meditation over a period of time. So in terms of coaching, you can do a quick breathing exercise with a client at the start of a session to help relax and center them. And you can introduce brief guided meditations as well. Now, not all clients like to do these, but if they do, it's a good option for them to practice that and have that become a habit. And you can also ask them to focus on observing, describing, acting with awareness, not judging and not reacting to whatever they are experiencing or what's happening to them. And I've included a mindfulness exercise here for you, a description. This is an everyday exercise, not meditation. So any activity that you do every day, it can be anything. And you all know probably about the eat a raisin exercise, mindfulness exercise, where you take the object and you look at it first and you smell it and you touch it, feel the touch, feel the taste. And if it makes any kind of a sound, you listen to it or you imagine how it would sound like. And you spend a minute or a couple of minutes just focusing on that one activity or object. It can be drinking a cup of tea as well, for instance, or eating something else, even washing the dishes. Just single task, focus on the mechanics of doing that task. Don't allow your mind to wander at all. Eliminate all worries. As I say, if you've got worries or thoughts that intrude, just let them pass through. Just say, here is a thought, and let it go. So you focus your attention 100% on each of the sensations you experience as you do it. And with some practice, this will also help you with your coaching presence, so that you are fully mindful when you're in front of a client, and you can invest 100% of your attention and energy to them. I think these you can have a look at on your own time. This is the mechanisms of mindfulness, emotion regulation in terms of exposure and reappraisal, body awareness, attention regulation, and a change in perspective, and the brain area that it actually involves. And with over time, it can change that brain area and the way it functions. And I've included a little bit of a scan for you of a brain that they took, a brain image that they took before and after only 10 minutes of meditation, and it will show you how strong the effect is. So on the left-hand side is the person's brain before they started to meditate, and on the right-hand side, after 10 minutes of meditation. And it shows you how it quietens the brain, especially the sensory and the somatosensory brain areas, which are the areas that are often overwhelmed by too many stimuli that come in from the outside, and your brain deciding what to do with them. And as a result, your stress levels and tenseness are reduced tremendously. Right, motivation. So this drives and sustains a person to act toward a goal, of course, and it strongly involves the brain's dopamine reward circuitry. Dopamine is released, as I've said before, when you anticipate a reward or a rewarding experience. Which is, of course, a pleasant experience that you anticipate. But when the dopamine is released, you already have some of that pleasant feeling. And that pleasant feeling just makes you motivated to act, to get to that reward and have even more of that pleasant feeling. So we are driven to pursue rewarding activities and avoid unpleasant experiences, like punishment, for instance. And one of the mechanisms is called stimulus response learning, where we expect or predict a reward and then act to increase the probability of that outcome. So if it works out, the whole process is repeated. And this is actually how addictions work as well. So if we get that pleasant outcome, we anticipate the next experience, dopamine is released, we feel the pleasantness already, expect more of it when we do that action, take that substance or whatever, and the whole process is like a snowball. So what can you do with a client? You can help them develop habits that support them and support achieving their goals, and recall memories from the past that help to guide and drive them, and already have some kind of a pleasant response as well. You can also focus on autonomy, purpose, and mastery with your client. So have them feel that they've got a purpose, that's their why that we often talk about, that they have autonomy, that they are responsible for their outcomes, and that they are in control of their outcomes, most of all, and more importantly. And you can also help them associate rewards and benefits with certain actions. So always ask them to most vividly as they can, describe what rewards and benefits can they associate with a certain action or with a certain change that they want to make. Beliefs. So a belief is an acceptance that something exists or is true, especially without proof. And as I've said here, beliefs are based on past experiences and it stimulate behavior. As you've seen in that cycle, when something happens to us and the whole cycle is completed, our brains tend to remember that as build a network around that as a belief. And the next time the same thing happens to us, we can just bypass a number of steps because it's similar to what has happened before, right? And it just triggers that belief and automatically, and the chemicals are released and we have certain thoughts and feelings. And if we don't step in and actually challenge that belief and reformulate and reappraise that belief, the whole thing will be reinforced and the belief will actually become stronger and stronger. And it can be good beliefs, make no mistake, but it can also be a negative belief or a limiting belief, which I've said here, beliefs are often limiting, block our best intentions, or close our minds to creative solutions. So we don't even think about it. A belief is triggered and it activates certain behavior without thinking whether there's a better, healthier alternative to do. So, and neurologically speaking, they are pathways formed over time with repetition and intensity. So as a coach, you can explore with your client how things would be if their belief did not exist or were different. So have them become aware of a belief, and it can be anything from that they are always failing, that they are a failure, that they are unworthy of love. There are a couple of fairly typical limiting beliefs, and then have them logically examine the logic, accuracy, and validity of that belief in different contexts and conditions. So, is this belief always true, for instance, or are there exceptions? And a belief, your brain tends to think of it as always true. So, if you can start to see that it's maybe conditional, that it's just sometimes true, you can trust, for instance, some people, then you've won half of the fight already. And if you've started to do that, then you can start formulating healthier alternatives that you can try out the next time something similar happens. Like, for instance, when you criticize and you think you are just a failure, and you develop a healthier belief that often, when you criticize, it's not the criticism isn't valid. Next time you criticize, you won't just instinctively react in a negative way. Trust. Now, trust is very, very important, as you all know, in the coaching relationship. It's probably the one biggest thing that will make you get positive progress and a positive outcome with a client. It's got both emotional and logical components, and it works to make the interaction safer and more interactive between two or more people, like, for instance, between a coach and client. When we trust, our brain is freed up, so we don't have that threat response that we feel when we don't trust something or somebody. So our brain, our prefrontal cortex is freed up to engage in planning, decision making, creativity, and the higher levels of executive functioning um, that you need to actually put thought into action. And as I said, the activity of the amygdala is reduced and oxytocin released as well. So as a coach, it's very important that you create a safe space for your client, be authentic and be reliable. So if you do these things, if you're accepting, if you show empathy, um, your client will view it as a safe space for them to share anything, and not be criticized, not be judged, and for you to not be biased. So as an exercise, you can have your client make a list of the top 10 people who they want to be trusted by, and they can then write down all the ways that they can build trust with those individuals. Right, and just as a bit of a summary, so I've said here the neurological stimulus effect cycle is comprehensive and multifaceted, as you see. It involves everything basically of your brain, your body, and your psychology, including all your genetics, your past experiences. Everything that you've gone through is involved in this whole process. The brain structure and hormonal activity determine our psychological tendencies and responses. So they are very closely together. The amount and nature of the chemicals, for instance, that are released will determine how you think and feel, and how you react, and that whole cycle will repeat again. Very importantly, the brain structure and activity can be changed over time. It takes a bit of work and commitment, but it can be rewired. Effective coaching can induce changes to the wiring of the brain in order to support a client's goal achievement better. And I've mentioned a couple of things here that are all important for a happy brain: reduce stress, increase social bonding and belonging, which includes acceptance as well, motivation, beliefs, emotion regulation, and a feeling of autonomy. So if that you can build that with a client, they will have an excellent foundation to achieve their goals and feel fulfilled in the process. And all these aspects are actually enabled by optimism and healthy habits. And as you've seen, the golden thread throughout this whole cycle and process is mindfulness, which cultivates acceptance, relaxation, and focus. So if you can have that as a foundation together with optimism, and then go and build healthy habits with which to reduce stress, increase social bonding, motivation, change beliefs, and have the client cultivate better emotions, you are most certainly on the right way. So if you have any further questions, I'll try and answer those now. Yes, Tyler. I'm going to take this PowerPoint presentation and just put it. I've picked up 2 or so just typos. I'll correct those, put it in a PDF, and they will be available by tomorrow on the forum in the growth space. And please feel free to ask any questions there, ask for more details. This is basically an introduction, like a 101 introduction to brain-based coaching and how the brain structures and the brain chemicals fit into the whole process of coaching, which is still very important and very interesting for me as well. So have a look at the PDFs again, ask me some questions on the forum, and I'll try and answer them as best as I can. Chi, your coping pattern is determined by genetics, first of all, how your brain is structured. So what you can basically, how resilient you are, for instance, is partially genetic and partially trained or built through experience. So in terms of coping mechanisms, it will always be partially genetic and partially in terms of how you develop, especially during childhood. So in that regard, it's 50-50 or 70-30 or 30-70 or whatever, but it will be a play between nature and nurture in terms of how your natural coping mechanisms are. And they can be unhealthy. And then there are certain things that you can do to influence your brain wiring so that you are able to cope in different and more healthy ways. Tyler, the one book that I mentioned is under the references. It's called Neuroscience for Coaches, how to use the latest insights for the benefit of your clients. So a lot of these concepts come from the book, but of course that's a whole book that's got a whole lot more for you to go and read, including studies behind it and how it's used to inform coaching practices. So I think that's the best book that I found to start. And then I've given 2 other references as well that's online that you can go and have a look at. Thank you all. I really enjoyed talking to you, although I couldn't see you. But it's been very interesting, and really feel free to ask me any questions, and I'd love to answer it for you. Have a great rest of your day.